Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. So today we're going to dive into a really personal story. It's about a man named Omega and his journey from being a devout Muslim, living in a world of absolute certainty, to someone who dared to question everything he was ever taught. And really, this is the question at the heart of the whole thing. We're going to follow Omega's path from his upbringing in Senegal, where religion and culture are basically the same thing, to becoming an apostate and starting a new life in France. It's a journey that begins in a world where everything, and I mean everything, is certain. To really get Omega's story, you have to picture his childhood in Senegal. He describes a world where Islam wasn't just a religion you practiced on certain days. No, it was the very air you breathed. It was woven into the fabric of everyday life, shaping every social rule, every family dynamic, every single day. So Omega tells us that his childhood was, pretty comfortable. He had everything he needed. But it was also this split reality. He was living in two completely different educational worlds. On one side, you had his regular Western-style school, and on the other, you had the Quranic school. And these two worlds, they were just night and day. This contrast, wow, it really defined his whole education. In his Western school, if you got disciplined, it was to correct a mistake, right? But in Quranic school, physical punishment was seen as this necessary ordeal. It was a trial you had to go through to prove you were worthy of mastering the Quran. It was completely normalized, and that right there was his first real clue that maybe, just maybe, suffering was actually built into the system, an expected part of the deal. So as he gets a bit older, into his teenage years, you start to see the first cracks appear in that solid foundation. And it's not because he read some controversial book or anything. It was simpler than that. He just started looking at the world around him and asking these quiet questions that nobody seemed to have a good answer for. And this was the question that really kicked everything off for him. He's looking around at his community in Senegal, super devout, praying 5 times a day, deeply religious, but also living in pretty widespread poverty. And then he looks at these secular, non-believing countries that seemed so much more prosperous and honestly even happier. It just didn't add up. So you can just imagine the kind of internal conflict this creates, right? The official answers he'd get were things like, oh, this life is just a test for believers, or don't worry, the non-believers will burn in hell. But that totally clashed with what he was seeing with his own eyes. I mean, his own words say it all. We are the ones trying to get to the countries of the infidels. The religious logic was starting to fall apart. Okay, so as he gets older, the questions, they get bigger. And honestly, a lot more dangerous to his faith. He starts moving beyond just observing the economy around him and starts digging into the history and morality of Islam itself. And this is where things really take a critical turn. His big realization about slavery kind of happened in these 3 steps. First, it starts with this memory from when he was a kid, seeing these Mauritanian shopkeepers whose black assistants were living in what looked a lot like slavery. Then, years later, he starts reading about the trans-Saharan slave trade and realizes, whoa, nobody talks about this. And then comes the final, just gut-wrenching connection. He discovers that Islamic scripture doesn't actually abolish slavery. It legislates it. And suddenly, that childhood memory connects to this massive historical horror, and he just couldn't square that with a perfect divine religion. All right, so every story like this has that one moment, right? The tipping point. For Omega, it came when he was going through a really tough time personally. All those abstract intellectual questions, suddenly they became intensely personal, and it led him to put his faith and all his deepest fears to one final real-world test. So he's at his absolute lowest, feels totally alone, and he lands on this brutal piece of logic. This wasn't just him being emotional, it was a cold, hard deduction. If there's an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good God, then his suffering just made no sense. And that thought, that simple, powerful thought, pushed him to do something about it. And this led him to his test. He decided he was going to consciously break one of the 5 pillars of Islam. For the very first time in his entire life, he would not fast during Ramadan. Think about that. This is a direct challenge to the divine punishment he's been taught to fear since he was a child. And what happened? The big result? Absolutely nothing. The sky didn't fall, no lightning bolt came down, life just kept going. And he said that total lack of any consequence, that profound normalcy, that's what broke the spell for good. The fear was gone. So what now? What happens after the faith you've known your whole life just evaporates?
Well, for Omega, it meant he had to build a whole new way of looking at the world. And he had to navigate not just new freedoms, but some very real, very practical new problems. So to fill that void, Omega turned to humanism. And his new guiding principle became this simple phrase: the human before the dogma. It's about focusing on what we all share as people, our reason, our ethics, our sense of justice, instead of the rigid rules and divisions that religion can create. But, leaving a faith like this isn't some abstract thought experiment. There are real, tangible costs. He has to hide his non-belief from his parents just to protect them and their relationship. Dating within his own community is basically impossible. And then there's the very real financial risks, since under some interpretations of Islamic law, he could be cut off from his family's inheritance.
And that quote really hits home, doesn't it? It perfectly captures this impossible tightrope that so many people in his position have to walk. The journey to your own truth is deeply personal, but the consequences are very, very social. For him and for so many others, hiding the truth isn't about being dishonest. It's a matter of survival, really. It's about protecting the people you love. At the end of the day, Omega's story is this incredible journey from a world where everything is certain to a world where you have to find your own truth. It really makes you think, doesn't it? In a life where our communities define so much of who we are, what's the real cost? But also, what's the real reward of finding a truth that's yours and yours alone? Thanks for joining us.